Good evening and welcome everyone to tonight's BoDCast on mental health. My name is Edwin Shuker. I'm Vice President of the Board of Deputies of British Jews and Chair of the Community's Interfaith and Education Division. It is today my honor to introduce today's panel and to introduce this BoDCast. For 260 years, the Board of Deputies has worked with synagogues and organizations through democratically elected deputies to become the undisputed democratic voice of British Jewry. We are here to protect and advance the interest of British Jewry. And I think we do that quite well. The Board of Deputies has hosted a series of BoDCasts to bring important conversations and sometimes difficult to the community, and we are delighted to be joined by people who represents the skillful thing of the mental health in Jewish mental health set. In support of Jami's Mental Health Awareness Shabbat, we are proud to bring together key individuals to raise the profile of mental health in the Jewish community. We hope the evening's conversation will also play a part in removing the stigma and discrimination which is preventing too many people from seeking much needed support. I want to express my personal thanks to Deputy Annabelle Deiches and from my division, and to the social action group behind her, and to Lauren Kailis for putting together this panel and this conversation. I now would like to hand over to our Chief Executive, Gillian Merron, who will be chairing the evening's panel. Thank you.
Many thanks to our Vice President, Edwin Shuker, for the introduction to tonight's conversation. First of all, to our audience, welcome. And I'd like to ask you if you would let us know where you are watching from. So please do put that in the chat so that we can see where we've got viewers from undoubtedly all around the country and indeed perhaps across the globe. My name is Gillian Merron. I'm Chief Executive of the Board of Deputies of British Jews, and it is a great honour to be chairing the panel this evening. And it's on an evening where we find ourselves at a time where 1 in 8 children have a diagnosable mental health disorder, at a time when 52% of university students report that their mental health has been negatively affected by COVID-19, and at a time when nearly half of adults are thinking that they have had a diagnosable mental health condition at some point in their lives. It is therefore, in my view, of the utmost importance that the Jewish community comes together to have the kind of discussion that we're going to have this evening. At the Board of Deputies, we are proud to advocate for parity of esteem, the principle by which mental health must be given equal priority to physical health as enshrined in UK law. So, holding that in mind, I am delighted to introduce our panellists. Laurie Rackind, who is the Chief Executive of JAMH UK, the mental health service for the Jewish community. Judy Silkoff, Director of Operations at the Board of Deputies, who is speaking tonight as a parent carer. Sandie Mann, the Clinical Lead from Jami, the umbrella organisation, which I should have said, Jewish Action for Mental Health. Forgive me, Sandie.
That's okay.
You're very forgiving, thank you. So Sandie is from the Jewish Action for Mental Health, the umbrella organisation which most Jewish mental health organisations in Greater Manchester are affiliated to. And Debby Klein, a service user and consultant. So how are we going to do this evening? Well, first of all, each panellist will make a brief introduction. I will then, when those introductions are complete, ask a follow-up question. And then I'll be opening up the conversation to ask the panellists questions that have been submitted from you, our viewers. So to submit those questions, please do write them in the comments section of the live stream. So let's go over to our panelists to introduce themselves and to make their opening remarks. So I'm going to start with Laurie. Laurie, over to you.
Thank you, Gillian, and thank you very much for inviting me and for setting up this panel. Particularly now, when we set the date for Mental Health Awareness Shabbat, and it's still always the same Parsha every year, Parsha Bo, we didn't realise that this was going to be clearly almost the eye of the storm in terms of the pandemic. It's also Blue Monday today. In any year, statistically apparently is the lowest point in terms of people's mental health during the year. Clearly this year has been a bigger year for mental health than almost any other, probably in most people working in mental health lifetime. As Jami hit, as the pandemic hit, Jami had a caseload of around about 1,100 people. And our first priority was to do a risk assessment of all those people to work out who it was that was most at risk, and we had to stay in contact with. We came up with a list of around about 350 people, and for those people, it was absolutely essential that we stayed in contact with them. At the start of the pandemic and throughout, people have been talking about social distancing, but we have much preferred the concept of physical distancing, not social distancing, because certainly in mental health, one of the key things we need to do is to socially connect, not to distance ourselves. So we've focused on that concept from the start. So that physical connection and the social connection included meals that we were delivering to those people that, for a lot of them, the only hot meal they were getting was at one of our hubs, and we were delivering those meals in. But very quickly we realised that one of the most important things wasn't the meal itself, but it was the doorstep chats that were happening as we were delivering those meals. We had all staff and volunteers were redeployed to focus on the most needy people, those with the biggest needs amongst our service users. We had to develop a virtual reception so that people could stay in contact with us. Of course, it's all very well to say that we were meeting with people virtually rather than physically, but for a lot of people, and particularly our service users, they didn't have those digital devices to stay in contact. So we very quickly had to procure and distribute tablet computers with SIM cards, because for most people they didn't have access to Wi-Fi either. Through the period of the pandemic, our staff team has increased by 25%. We've now got over 70 staff, over 50 of which are mental health professionals. Initially, as with a lot of mental health services, referrals were actually initially flat. We then got an increased demand of from people that had previously been using Jami services, and the pandemic had caused their mental health to deteriorate, and then they got back into contact with us. Now, at the latter, what we hope is the latter stages, albeit the biggest peak in terms of the viral curve, we are getting absolute biggest peak in terms of our referrals. In most areas, we're getting nearly 200%, so nearly 3 times the referrals. The particular spikes are in carers and family support, and I know Judy will be speaking about that later, older adults and younger adults. It's been clearly an absolutely massive challenge for the whole of the staff team, who have to deal with all the things that, the homeschooling, all the things that they've got to deal with at the same time of supporting some very vulnerable members of the community. Alongside all of this, we realised that although we've added to our staff team, we could potentially struggle to meet demands even with that. So we procured a couple of online platforms where you can get online counselling, one for adults and one for students, called Quell and Couth, and that at least gives people somewhere to go for all sorts of mental health resources and online counselling to kind of sit alongside the Jami services as well. But as I said, I'll finish where I started. It's absolutely pleasure to be invited. And the one positive thing of the pandemic is that mental health is being talked about a lot more than it was at the start, and that can only be a good thing.
Thank you, Laurie. That's a very wise point to make. And you rightly remind us that this is said to be the day in which they're, where the lowest mood, where there is most depression around. So it's perhaps particularly timely we meet today. So thank you for that. And over to Judy.
Thank you, Gillian. So I think we're probably going to hear quite a lot this evening about the effects of the pandemic on mental health. But my story actually predates the pandemic by some years. My credentials for speaking to you this evening are as the mother of my beautiful, kind, clever and talented daughter, Ruth. Ruth's now 19, but it was about 5 years ago when she was 14 years old that she first began to experience panic attacks and anxiety, mostly in school at first. We used our private health insurance, which we were very fortunate to have, to pay for a series of CBT, that's cognitive behavioural therapy, sessions for her. And we really thought that was all that would be needed. But unfortunately, things continued to get worse. Eventually, Ruth was referred to the NHS CAMH service, that's the Children and Adolescent Mental Health Service. But by the time Ruth was assigned a regular therapist, things had escalated even further. She was starting to self-harm, her anxiety had turned into a really relentless form of depression, she was barely attending school, and she was beginning to experience what's known as suicidal ideation, which means she was thinking about wanting to take her own life. The beauty of CAMHS is that it's multidisciplinary. So that meant Ruth could access lots of different types of therapy, including psychotherapy, family therapy, which we also attended as her parents, and mindfulness. And she was also started on medication. But nothing seemed to help at all. And although there were periods when she was just about okay, most of the time she was suffering tremendously. And of course, as her parents and our other children who were living at home at the time, we suffered right along with her. Things really came to a head during her GCSEs, which is when the suicidal thoughts became so strong, it was clear she might actually seriously act on them. She was admitted to the paediatric ward in the Royal Free Hospital, which is the hospital nearest our home. And after 2 weeks, when she tried to seriously self-harm right there on the ward under the nose of her mental health nurse, who was actually asleep, she was finally admitted as an NHS patient to a very well-known private mental health unit in Southgate. She was there for 7 months. And for most of that time, she was really very ill. Despite everything, she aced her GCSEs while she was in hospital. And eventually she reached the point where she was well enough to be discharged. But in hindsight, it's clear that while she learned to survive in hospital in the unit, she hadn't been given enough tools and there wasn't enough follow-up care for her to be able to survive in the real world. And it was only 4 weeks later that things declined so far that she had to go back to the Royal Free. This time she was actually there for a month on a little bed in a cubicle until a proper place could be found for her. And this time it was at an NHS unit called the Beacon Centre, which is in Edgware. Ruth had obviously been speaking to lots of other young people who were in similar positions to her, and she had not heard good things about the Beacon from them. She'd actually become institutionalised to the point that she only wanted to go back to the place she was before, even though I think that she knew on some level it wasn't good for her and the care hadn't been good enough. So eventually we actually had to get her sectioned to get her to go to the Beacon, and that was really, truly very heartbreaking, and I wouldn't wish that situation on anybody. So she moved to the Beacon. The Beacon, I can tell you, is an ugly building. The building is falling apart. There was a point there when some of the young people had to sleep on mattresses in the patient lounge for a few days because the ceiling was going to fall in upstairs. She had to move rooms, I think, 3 times because there were sewage leaks in the bathroom, which I think speaks volumes to how little mental health has been prioritised by the NHS over the past few years. But the reason I'm mentioning the Beacon by name is not to denigrate them, but to say that the care she received there was absolutely gold standard. I had never seen anything like it before, and we'd been in the system some years by then. And I really do credit that place with saving her life. She was there for 10 months, I think. And as she approached her 18th birthday, we knew she would have to leave because she would be a legal adult and she couldn't stay there anymore. But the staff that cared for her fought tooth and nail to keep her there until they found a suitable follow-up programme. So now Ruth has been diagnosed with a personality disorder, and I think the diagnosis really helps her come to terms with what she's dealing with. She lives in a self-contained flat in a brand new sheltered accommodation build in Barnet, not too far from our home. There are support staff on hand there 24/7, so if she needs someone, there's someone there, but she can live like any other young person just starting out in life. She's a year behind on her schooling because of all the time she missed when she was in hospital, but she's now attending sixth form college, which she will actually finish at the end of this year. She's studying for a triple BTEC in health and social care, and she's applying to university to study paediatric nursing. I'm acutely aware that Ruth's mental health can still be fragile, but I hope that our story, which is at the more extreme end of the spectrum, can give other parents like us hopes for the future. For over 4 years, it was like someone had rubbed her out from the world, but now she is back at the heart of it, and she is not only surviving, but thriving.
Thank you very much, Judy. And you bring the story to life when you talk about Ruth, and we wish her all success in everything I know that she's doing with your support too. So thank you, Judy. Let's go now to Sandie.
Hello, good evening. Thank you very much for having me here tonight. So just a little bit about myself, a bit of background. Obviously, I'm clinical lead for JAM. I'll tell you about that in a moment. But I'm also a chartered academic psychologist, specialising in emotions, particularly anxiety and depression. I'm a private therapist as well, specialising in CBT, which has already been mentioned tonight, and also a therapy called EMDR. I don't know if Judy came across that on her travels, but that's also a very good therapy to come across. I'm a university lecturer, so I teach applied clinical psychology. So that brings me into contact with a lot of students. So I've had a lot of interactions with them. Gives me a greater understanding in terms of the difficulties that they're facing at the moment, particularly. Clinical lead of JAM and also of another national organisation, not a Jewish organisation, called Sparta Health. I've also written, I think, about 25 psychology books, some of which are self-help psychology books. So that's a little bit about myself. I'm here really to represent JAM, to talk about JAM, Jewish Action for Mental Health, which is an organisation that is very young. We're a bit of a baby in that sense. We're only 2 years old. And we were set up 2 years ago in Manchester in response to a number of events in the community. And until March 2020, we were doing a lot of educational stuff. We were an umbrella organisation for mental health in the Manchester area and the surrounding area. We had lots of dreams and ambitions, and we were gently approaching those and working towards many of those things. March 2020 hit, and suddenly our remit changed dramatically. Suddenly we're all in crisis mode, and we developed into a service that we didn't know we were going to develop, and something that perhaps we would have done 5 years down the line instead of 1 year down the line. But now we are the leading, if not the only, provider of free counselling and psychotherapy for anybody over the age of 9 in the Manchester area, Jewish people in the Manchester area, or people who describe themselves as Jewish in the Manchester area. And that's our main source of what we do. That's the main thing that we're most proud of. Since March 2020, we've triaged over 180 people, and we've provided therapy to over 150 individuals in that time. We've got a bank of 35 therapists in the area. They're all professional, they're all accredited with appropriate organisations, and they're all qualified, and we're able to provide professional therapy for clients who need it. We, in relation to that, we also provide monthly peer supervision for therapists, and sometimes even art sessions. We try to look after our family of therapists as well as the people who are service users. We have other groups as well as the actual therapy. We do other things in terms of social prescribing, in other words, putting on events that will help improve people's mental health. So it's not just about helping people when their mental health is struggling. We're very passionate about doing things to keep people's mental health going, especially in these very difficult times. So we have regular art sessions, cookery. We have an art group that meets once a week. I'm going to go along on Thursday. I'm really excited about that. I think we're doing watercolour. We do special cookery sessions. We've done all sorts of different things. We have a special group for what I call COVID mums. These are mums who have had babies during the pandemic or who are pregnant during the pandemic. Very, very difficult for them. We have a special group that meets every other week, and they also have a walking group. And we've also had a homeschooling group for parents who have been struggling with homeschooling. So we're very proud of the work that we've done and the work that we're doing. We work with other organisations in Manchester. We have a strong partnership with organisations such as Neshama. Those of you in Manchester may have heard of Neshama. And we're very proud to work with lots of other organisations. I'm really pleased, as I think Laurie said, that now mental health is on the agenda. And I'm really pleased that it is. I'm sorry that it's taken this very difficult series of events to get us to that place. But mental health is on the agenda now, and there's lots of organisations that are looking to improve provision. I'm very proud that JAM is a proud supporter of Jami's Mental Health Shabbat, Mental Health Awareness Shabbat, and we have our own event, Motzei Shabbat after Shabbat, which is a positive event. We're looking at laughter and positive things to do with this current situation that we find ourselves in. So that's where we're at. That's where I'm at, and it's an absolute honour to be here tonight.
Thank you, Sandie, and thanks to you and your team for all the work you're doing in the Manchester area. I know how appreciated it is. So, Debbie, over to you.
Thank you, Gillian. Hello, good evening to all our audience. It's really lovely to be here. I'm billed as a consultant and a service user, and so it's very interesting about coming out. I have been diagnosed with a disorder, and I really like the title of this panel, which is Change the Subject. And I think we could possibly think about changing the subject and also changing the language. There's an organization now called Drop the Disorder. So in terms of what I do, what I've been doing over COVID is providing telephone support for some of the people that Laurie was talking about, some of the people on the waiting list. I've been providing telephone support. For 2 other mental health organizations, I've been doing the same thing and running online groups. But I wanted to talk this evening about my experience as a service user. I feel it's really important to come out because, you know, even though it is changing and it's changed very much over my experience in the mental health system, there still is a lot of stigma. So it feels like just like gay people in the time needed to come out to prove their self-worth. Those of us with severe and enduring, which is what my diagnosis is called, mental health problems, it's quite important for us to come out and challenge stereotypes. Talking about diagnosis though, I've had 6 mental health diagnoses, and the one that stuck was bipolar. And it seems to me that that's very much because I'm a white, educated, middle-class woman. If I'd been a black man, I probably would have been diagnosed with schizophrenia. So it's not just drop the disorder. It's just like these diagnoses that we label people with are created by people, often men, around a table. And one of the things that I'm really passionate about in terms of my own experience and the work I do is actually changing the agenda. So we really stop dehumanizing people and we see the whole person and stop lazy stereotypes about people with mental ill health. I've been in the mental health system for 25 years in and out, and although I don't really need services much these days, I kind of carry the trauma and the legacy. And it's interesting that people in my position often call ourselves survivors of the mental health system, whereas you rarely hear of people calling themselves survivors of the cancer system. And although things are changing, there's a lot in statutory systems which are still not brilliant. In America, they have peer support houses where instead of going into hospital, people go into the house and they're staffed completely by peers. And it is just a completely transformative way of working. I think the idea of peer support is something that Jami and other organizations and the statutory services have taken on, which is really valuing people like myself who've been through the system, that we have an insight. I talk about my mental health as a way of challenging taboos, and so I was very touched by what Judy was saying about her daughter and her experiences in the mental health system. But what I think is at the moment is that in terms of changing the conversation, we talk a lot about talking about mental health. It's become a real kind of slogan in the mental health system, is that we need to talk about mental health. And my question, I suppose, tonight is, but what sort of conversations do we need to have about mental health? What sort of conversations are important to have? In my experience of my mental health history, I've had psychotic episodes and I've had severe suicidal depressions, and so very extreme. And I've made major attempts on my life 5 times. And suicide is the one thing that I think is the taboo of mental health. Suicide is the taboo of the taboo. So again, it's something that I talk about because I want to change the agenda. And one of the things that I do at the moment is I do voluntary work for the Listening Place, which is a place where people can go and talk if they feel that life isn't worth living anymore. And it's got no safeguarding issues. You can basically go there and talk about anything that you want to, and they've just been overwhelmed with clients. And it's really interesting that need is there in the mental health system. So yes, that's me, and those are some of the things that I'm interested in talking about. And again, what sort of conversation do we want to be having about mental health? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Debbie. It's a very good question. I hope one that we will develop this evening. And you make a very powerful and very personal point, which is greatly appreciated, about seeing the whole person, not seeing a label. Really important. So thank you to each of our panelists for making introductory remarks. I'm now going to have the take the privilege of chairing this by asking each of them their own particular question. And I'm going to start with Sandie. Sandie, obviously coronavirus has had a huge impact on our society. So what would your reflections be? We've had so much change and uncertainty. So how have those mental health services had to adapt? And can you tell us a bit about what kind of advice you'd give to people who might be struggling with their mental health in a way perhaps they haven't had to struggle with before? You know, the world is changing. So what thoughts do you have about, as I say, how mental health services adapt, and the advice for those who are struggling?
Thank you. 2 big questions. So, yeah, our world's changed in March last year, and for mental health service providers, they had to adapt. Now, they've not all adapted well. Some of them have been quite slow to adapt. Some of them have been faster. Obviously, we've had to try and move everything remote as far as we can. At JAM, our change was just incredible, because we changed from not providing counselling and therapy to that being one of our main features. So we did change dramatically, and most of our therapy and counselling is provided remotely where possible. But I think one of the really important challenges for mental health services is, and to all businesses actually, but mental health services, is to be flexible and be creative. And a lot of our clients, a lot of the people that we're working with, don't necessarily have access or easy access to Zoom or to remote technology. or they don't have a private space in their room, in their house to work from or to speak to us from, or they don't feel safe, or it's not confidential to work from. So there's lots of challenges to that we've had to try and adapt to. We've had to try and think of different ways to reach people. And I think some mental health services, if we're not just talking about JAM, but we're talking about NHS services, have struggled with some of that because obviously they've got certain systems. And one of the really nice things about being a new young organisation at JAM is that we're still developing our systems, and so we can be more flexible and more adaptable. So I think that flexibility is really key. The other challenges that I think mental health services have had are perhaps the changing nature of what people are presenting with. I think, as you said, I think Gillian tonight, or Laurie said, I can't remember exactly who said, but we've got perhaps a different demographic. We've got people coming forward with mental health issues who may not have had mental health issues in the past. We've certainly got people who have had mental health issues in the past, and COVID has exacerbated that. But we've also got perhaps a new group of people who didn't have issues in the past. We're seeing, I think, more young people. We're definitely seeing more young people in lockdown 3, or I am, than in lockdown 1. I think lockdown 1 was challenging and difficult, but for some people there was a novelty to it. There was something new and something that we thought there would be an end in sight quite soon. I know right at the beginning I kind of thought that in 12 weeks it'll all be over and we'll all be back to normal. Oh, how naive I was. But I don't think I was the only one. But now we're in lockdown 3, we're battle weary, we're tired, we're exhausted from it all. And I'm certainly seeing young people who in lockdown 1 managed to cope with school closures. The sun was shining. They didn't have as many lessons, perhaps, they had more freedom. But lockdown 3 has been very different. Exams cancelled again for the second year. We're getting a lot of young people coming forward. I'm certainly seeing a lot more young people than I have done in the past, and we've got to respond to that. We're also getting a lot of cases where, I mean, if we look at the sort of cases that JAM are getting through, our statistics show that most of the cases we're seeing are going to be anxiety and depression. Over 85% of people coming forward are suffering from anxiety and depression. But we're also seeing a lot of people who have long-term conditions. And I think this is something that's really important about what's being raised tonight by both Judy and Debby, that we have a lot of people in our communities with long-term conditions, and these aren't just something that a quick fix of short-term therapy is going to solve. And some of the challenges with mental health services is how to respond to that. And it's a challenge that we have, and it's a challenge that mental health services have. And we're seeing a lot of people coming to us who are really being batted around from place to place, from agency to agency, who haven't had the support that they need, the long-term support, and are still not getting it. And it's really, really difficult. It's a real challenge that, okay, maybe we're responding now to people with short-term issues, or people that can be responded to in a short term. And we're responding to perhaps the less severe cases much better than we have done in the past. But it's the people with the longer term cases, the complex cases that worry me the most. I think the people that are not able to access services, those longer term provisions that we've heard about tonight, some of which have been very good, but it's very mixed out there. So I think that's one of the challenges, one of the big challenges, another the big challenges that we're facing. In terms of what we can do to help, advice. The thing that I always say to people is it has to be individual. There's no magic wand. I can't give you a list now of 5 things that do this and you'll feel okay. There's a whole raft of things that we need to do depending on the situation that you're in, and we've got to look at anxiety, depression. We've got to look at how you're filling your days. We've got to look at lots of different ways to achieve this, and it's not a quick fix that I can give you 5 top tips, I'm afraid.
If only you could. We understand. Thank you very much for that, Sandie. Over to you, Debbie. I wanted to ask you a question. I know you're an advocate for both an individualistic as well as a trauma-informed approach. Can you tell us a bit about how you think that this helps you? And do you think that this practice is especially important for people in the Jewish community?
So thank you, Gillian.
You're welcome.
I would say individual, not individualistic. Individualistic sounds a bit neoliberal, so I don't think I am.
I withdraw that.
But I think they're two sides of the same coin. I mean, if you're looking at a trauma-informed approach, and one of the things about a trauma-informed approach that's really key is it says, don't ask what's wrong with me, ask what happened to me. That's the trauma-informed approach. So that takes the individual history, the very specific history of an individual, and looks at the trauma that's happened in their lives. And for me, one of the traumas was actually the treatment I got in the mental health system, some of which was cruel and some of which was just really inept. But so I think they're both two sides of the same coin. However, I mean, it's really interesting because the recovery approach, which I taught for many years to mental health professionals, was very individual, and it was a real challenge to the kind of medical model which labeled everyone and looked at their diagnosis. So it was very important, but it tended to see people as individual units, and you're either the hero, look how wonderful I am because I've been through so much, or the victim of your journey. And one of the things which Laurie knows, because he's part of it, is we're doing at Jami, is we're kind of working on a strategy which looks at the wider systems that really affect people. So we'd be looking at a whole different way of seeing mental ill health if we saw it in a human rights perspective. So one of the things is looking at equality and human rights. Another thing is to look at austerity, which Sandie was just talking about. Services, they've been cut, but also the way that people are treated in the system. Often people with mental health issues are on benefits, and this can be really kind of traumatic. So we're looking at austerity, and we're looking at the social model, so access, and the social model which was started by the disability movement looks at not like you're impaired, but how society sets up barriers. So with disability, it might be that, well, there's no ramp, or I can't get on this bus. Whereas now we're looking at taking that model and seeing in terms of mental health, it's not what's wrong with me. Social isolation is a huge area for people with mental health issues, and what is it in the mainstream society? So very quickly, because I'm sure I'm running out of time now, I'm just getting a bit passionate here. The Jewish community, it's really hard to be specific, but one of the things that I think about, because there's so many Jewish communities, but one of the things is the pressure to be successful, I think, is something that I had in my upbringing and is part of the Jewish community, and how that, and people I've been talking to in terms of the work I've been doing really feel that sense of, when their mental health isn't good, that they haven't been able to achieve. And finally, the big thing, the obvious thing when we talk about trauma, or one of the things about trauma, is intergenerational trauma. And we've seen with Black Lives Matter how the legacy of slavery and racism is still there. Well, the Holocaust, I'm the daughter of a Auschwitz and slave labor camp survivor who lost most of his family in the war, and some of that, and I was the one who was going to prove Hitler wrong. And I think, really that intergenerational trauma, it is talked about in some circles, but it's time we brought it into the center of mental health, because I do think we know with all sorts of peoples that intergenerational trauma really goes on affecting generations in different ways. And I think it's a very interesting conversation, rather than putting the Holocaust as a kind of memorial, but seeing it as a kind of living legacy. So that's where I'd like to end.
Thank you very much, Debbie. Laurie, I want to put to you about the increasing number of young people who are experiencing mental health problems. with schools closing because of dealing with the pandemic, and the same for universities, do you think that there are sufficient resources being invested to deal with this, or do you think that more young people are going to be slipping through the net without the necessary support?
Thank you, Gillian. I'm not sure I'll be able to answer the question totally in the time allotted.
Of every confidence.
But what I would say is that early intervention is absolutely key in almost all areas of mental health. And the evidence is that, for instance, first episodes of psychosis, 80% of people, and I almost tend to want to avoid use of the word recovery for the reasons that Debby spoke about earlier, but 80% of people will make a recovery if they get the right interventions after that first episode. Now, the problem is that, and you raised the subject of parity of esteem, Julian. Unfortunately, it's just a pipe dream. I mean, if you actually look at the prevalence of mental ill health as against physical ill health, it's massive, and yet the investment has got to go so much further before we even get anywhere close to that. I think that Sandie made a really good point. I mean, the problem is that even where there are services available, people get battered around. They don't know where to go, and that's part of the problem, and particularly with younger people, where I would argue the stigma is less than with older adults. In terms of more prepared, younger people are more prepared to talk about their mental health. They put their head above the parapet, they seek help, they ask for help, and then they don't know where to go, or they're battered around. And it just doesn't encourage people to continue doing that. And unfortunately, it really is a challenge. Unfortunately, in terms of the pandemic and young adults, unfortunately, I think, I'm sorry to not be able to put a really positive spin on this, but I think depending on the demographic, there are people, it's going to impact on people's mental health almost regardless of where they started from. So the reason I say that, there's some evidence, for example, that young adults who are experiencing issues, for instance, with social anxiety, actually are experiencing a fairly good time during lockdown, but they are going to experience a really bad time when we come out of lockdown. Conversely, students that didn't have that issue before, they are the ones that potentially are being impacted the most by lockdown and adversely affected their mental health. So almost regardless, we're going to have issues here. And yes, I started by saying that we're in the eye of the storm in terms of the viral curve, so to speak. Unfortunately, and it's sad to say, we're almost just at the start of the peak, if you like, in terms of mental health. And the mental health curve is going to have a far longer tail, unfortunately, than the viral curve.
Thank you very much for that insight, Laurie. And from that one, I'm going to turn to Judy. Judy, I thank you again for sharing with us your family's story. If you had one important message to give to other parents or carers who would be starting out on a journey similar to yours, what would that important message be?
If you'll forgive me, Gillian, I'd actually like to say three things. And two of them I'm going to address.
Judy, I can never stop you.
I know, you'll let me. Two of the things I want to say are addressed directly to parents or indeed to carers of those experiencing mental illness. And the third one is to the carers of the carers, to the people who are the friends and family of those parents and individuals put in that situation where they are caring for someone who's unwell. So first of all, to parents, I want to say you're your child's best advocate. You're going to be surrounded by doctors and professionals who are advising you and telling you what's going on, and it can be extremely overwhelming. But you have to remember that aside from your child, who may not be in a position to be able to speak for themselves, you are most likely the person who knows them best, and you should not be afraid to advocate for your child. I had situations where the professionals were telling us that Ruth was ready to be discharged, and I knew she was not ready to be discharged and she would not be safe if she came home. And I pushed back, and I was able to get them to listen to me, and she was able to stay where I knew she could be safe. I had one situation when she was first admitted to the first unit she was in, where she was given a new medication and she was clearly allergic to it. She phoned me up and it was as though she was drunk or she was on drugs. She was clearly not herself. And I called the staff and said, please check in on Ruth, something's not right. And they told me she's faking. And I knew she wasn't faking because that's not how she behaves. And I had to really push to get them to take care of her, but I was able to do that. So if you are able to advocate for your child, don't be afraid to do so. The other message I want to give to parents is don't forget to look after yourself. The situation you find yourself in will take its toll. It's not easy to be going through this, and you may feel that it's not possible to simultaneously be suffering pain for what your child is going through and filled with fear about the future, and at the same time find moments where you can relax and enjoy yourself. But I've learned that it is possible to hold those two kind of streams of being at the same time, and if you're able to tap into that, it's really important to help you get through the situation. And the final thing I want to say speaks to what you mentioned at the beginning, Gillian, and what Laurie was just saying about parity of esteem. But I'm talking about parity of esteem not in terms of the care that the individual receives, but in terms of the care that the individuals who are caring for the individual receive. I had a friend whose child was unfortunately diagnosed with cancer some time after Ruth was actually discharged. And I saw how the community rallied around her and how meals were delivered for her family and how her children were invited for play dates and how presents were dropped off and how there were charities ready to help her family. I spent a month sitting next to Ruth's bed in the Royal Free, trying to hold down my full-time job and coming home at the end of the day and cooking dinner for my family. My husband was away out at work teaching and he didn't have the flexibility in his work to do what I was doing, but he would visit in the evenings. And it took a massive toll on our family, but nobody did those things that they did for my friend whose child had cancer. And I'm very happy that that support is there for young people and children whose family who are going through a physical illness, but we need to start thinking about treating families who have a child undergoing mental illness in the same way. I think that is critical. I hope I didn't speak for too long.
No, spot on, Judy. And thank you for dividing up the messages you would give to the different parties and for making that point at the end. So now looking at the questions from our audience, and thanks very much for the questions. And the first one I want to ask about is one about stigma, and it's from Karen Maxwell. So thanks for the question, Karen. And the question is, do you think that the stigma has prevailed for longer in the Jewish community than in other parts of British society? And if so, why do you think that this is the case? And what would you like to see us doing? And I'm going to turn first of all to Sandie on that, if you'd like to start us off.
Yes, in answer to your question, Karen, yes, it has prevailed longer in the Jewish community, I believe, but not just the Jewish community. I do a lot of work with the Muslim community, actually, and it's similar there. Why is this the case? Lots of different reasons. One reason being, I work with a lot of the more religious elements of the communities, both in the Jewish and the Muslim communities. And one of the big factors that contributes to the stigma is in terms of marriage and arranged marriages or shidduchim, as we call them. And that has a big impact on how people view mental health. And to put it bluntly, people are afraid that if anybody in their family has any mental health condition, then that will reflect and have a negative impact on the marriage prospects of their entire family. And by any mental health issue, I'm talking about even spider phobia. I've had people coming to me with spider phobias who've had to keep it secret because that could impact on the marriage prospects. And that's similar within some sections of the Muslim community as well. So that's a big factor. Other elements, and I think this is interesting related to what Judy just said, in terms of how we regard mental health, is that something about it being seen, I think, as self-inflicted or a little bit self-inflicted, or something that we should be able to do something about. So if somebody, God forbid, has cancer, that's seen as something that is external to them and that's happened to them and everybody rallies round. But if it's mental health, then it's seen as a little bit of a weakness and that they should just pull themselves together and, you know, we don't need to help them so much because it's the sort of their own problem. And I think that's perhaps a little bit bigger in the Jewish community. maybe because we are a community traditionally that is resilient and that has had to step up and respond to challenges. And maybe that's something that is seen as a strength of the Jewish community. We don't like to be victims anymore. We don't like to have things that we can't get ourselves out of. So perhaps we value the idea of, education and bettering ourselves. And perhaps that includes mental health. So I think these factors contribute to the stigma, unfortunately.
Thank you very much, Sandie. Laurie, what's your view on stigma in the Jewish community?
I'd agree with Sandie. It's, I think almost without doubt, it is longer lasting and more significant in the Jewish community. I also agree that I think it's common not just for the Jewish community, but other minority groups. I would argue what groups that put a lot of value, if you like, on achievement and academic achievement and achievement at work or whatever, that tend to tend to do that. Very ironic that we talk about parity of esteem, and yet as a Jewish community, we're more than happy. We don't see it as a stigma as not showing athletic prowess. In fact, we almost kind of take pride on not having athletic prowess, which is quite bizarre if you think about it. So maybe in terms of parity of esteem, we ought to flip it. We love being mental health professionals. If you actually look at the number of Jewish psychiatrists, psychologists, psychoanalysts, therapists, boy, do we punch above our weight in terms of numbers. So we love talking about mental health, just perhaps not our own. So I think that's what's got to change. Panels like this wouldn't have happened a few years ago. As some of you will know, we've opened a couple of years ago a mental health cafe in the heart of the Jewish community, and it's just to do that, almost to slap the community in the face and say mental health is on the high street, it's here, it affects everybody, there is no stigma, come and talk about it. So I think yes, absolutely, I think the stigma is worse. We've got a job to do, but I think we've started with that work.
Thanks, Laurie, and a very fine cafe it is. Looking forward to it reopening when it can. Judy, your views on stigma in the Jewish community?
So I was really interested to hear what Sandie had to say about the religious community. My experience is in the Orthodox community. Obviously, anything I say is anecdotal. I don't have any data to back up what I'm saying. I expected stigma to exist in the strictly Orthodox and the Haredi community. What I didn't expect was to find it in the modern Orthodox community. When Ruth first became ill, I didn't talk about really what we were going through, apart from to a few people, because I felt I didn't want to stigmatize her, ironically. And then when she was first hospitalized, which was just for a couple of days, I didn't tell anyone. I didn't tell my parents because I didn't want to frighten them. When she was eventually hospitalized for 2 weeks, I decided enough was enough, and I was going to start talking about it, which is my usual way of doing things. I'm quite open about things like this. And I was shocked at how many people reached out to me from across the spectrum of the Orthodox community in particular about what their families were going through, about themselves, about their children, and that they couldn't speak about it. And that still goes on. People contacting me probably once a week with a story and asking for advice, and they're not speaking out about it. I think the only way to change that is for organisations like Jami and like JAMH to speak up and to speak out, and to have wonderful cafes like Headroom, which I also can't wait till it reopens on the high street, and also for people to educate themselves on how to speak about mental health and to speak to people who are undergoing mental health issues. We're very casual with our language. We say things like, I'm never going to get through this, I'm going to kill myself, as a general sort of throwaway comment, and you don't realise the effect that has on people who are experiencing genuine suicidal feelings. So we need to learn how to talk about mental health, how to accept that it's not something that someone's brought upon themselves, as Laurie says, and just keep talking and continue the conversations.
Thanks, Judy. And Debbie, your thoughts on stigma in the Jewish community?
Well, a lot's been said, which I completely agree with. And I think it's interesting, that issue with faith communities, that it's not just the Jewish community, it's the Muslim communities as well. And the other side of that, I read a paper recently about how difficult it was. This was talking about Muslim communities accessing mental health services and therapy because they didn't speak the same language. And it's also about people in faith communities, for those people who are practicing, and that's kind of at the heart of what they do, then it's about having flexible services. So the way they perceive the world is embraced in those services. And I think that's what the Jewish services do. But I don't know what it's like for those people to kind of access statutory services when, you know, at the hub that can kind of take on board the really important points for them, including kind of how their family are perceiving it, and issues about arranged marriage, and just central issues about belief in God as the mover and shaker rather than a drug or therapy.
Thanks very much, Debbie. A good point to go to our next question. And that's about getting mental health services in the Jewish community to reach those who are harder to reach. For example, perhaps those in the Haredi community, or those geographically who live far outside the areas of concentration of the Jewish community. So I'm going to turn first of all to Laurie and then to Sandie.
Thanks, Gillian. In terms of the Haredi community, I think, you know, the time that I've been working in mental health, things have thankfully changed a lot. If you'd asked me that question a few years ago, I would have said there's just complete denial. I think things have changed, and whilst their stigma is still rife, as we've spoken about, I think there is more of an acceptance that they will reach out to qualified clinical professionals. And in fact, a lot of the work that we do in the Haredi community, whilst it might well be that people don't come directly to us, although some do, we do a lot of business-to-business work, in the sense that the smaller Haredi generic social care and health charities will come to us. Their professionals will work with our professionals in terms of supporting their own client base. So I think thankfully things are changing in that regard. In terms of the geographical reach and people living far outside the most concentrated Jewish centres, if you like, that I think is certainly one of the benefits, if you like. Hopefully there are some benefits of the pandemic, that, as Sandie mentions, all the organisations have had to completely pivot and change their services. Before we recruited an additional 25% of our staff team, we were doing 50% more in the digital space than we were physically, just because it's easier to do that. And I think there used to be in many respects a rightful challenge on Jami that we were too London and South East centric, and that was purely very pragmatic. For pragmatic reasons, we just had to be careful. The use of our resources were 100% voluntary funded, and we couldn't be sending a worker over to Reading or Swansea as often as we would do in parts of London. But I think what's happened is that we've now got, we've completely leapfrogged that, and we've got service users now in America, Gateshead, Edinburgh, Bournemouth, Bat Yam, you name it, because people are able to utilise services, and that's a really good thing. And I think the challenge will be when we hopefully come back to what looked like a bit like our previous services, we can pick and choose, we can blend and offer and make best use of when those physical services were really needed, but where they weren't, we can continue to offer some really effective interventions by use of technology.
Thanks. Sandie, have you got anything to add?
I'd just like to add about reaching the Haredi community. We do a lot of work with the Haredi community, and one of the things I'd like to do is perhaps rephrase the question a little bit. It's not necessarily just about how to reach the Haredi community with therapy, but how to reach them with appropriate therapy. And one of the problems that we've seen a lot of in Manchester, I don't know what it's like in London, is that there's this culture of within certain sectors of the community of using therapists that are recommended or have a hechsher from a particular rabbi but don't have the qualifications or accreditations that we would expect within the professional service. So we have a big problem of non-qualified, non-accredited therapists or people who call themselves therapists who get the hechsher but aren't necessarily giving the right service. And that's something that we're really trying to work with the rabbis so that the rabbinical organizations understand about accreditation. And it is a very complex thing, accreditation and qualifications. It's very complex. A lot of people don't understand it. I struggle sometimes with all the different things that are out there, but we're really trying to educate so that if the rabbonim are giving hechshers, that they give hechshers to appropriately qualified people.
Thank you very much for your answers on that. So let's move to thinking about how we speak to children, which has come in as a question. And the question is, I have young children and know that I need to teach them about mental health and make sure that they know it's an important thing to talk about. How do you suggest that I approach this? So I'm going to come first of all to Debbie and then go to Judy.
I think it's being honest about emotion is with young children. You know, it's not frightening them with or kind of blinding them with science, but it's being honest about emotion. I mean, there's something that probably young children need to know as they start growing up in this brave world of social media where everyone is happy, everyone's leading a great life, and you know, it's all about showing what you're doing, and actually challenging that may be the most important thing, and sort of saying things like, mummy feels sad today, and you know, sometimes I get worried about things, and just kind of making those things really gently, the emotions about being worried or anxious or sad or having a cry is a perfectly normal, and that some people can get them for a long time and be really unwell with them, and that's what happens. But I mean, I think it's emotional literacy to start off, you know, so it doesn't have to be kind of bright. And we're a society which kind of needs to be positive and happy, and we need both sides of the coin, I think.
Sure, that's true. Thank you, Debbie. Judy, your advice.
Thanks, Gillian. Well, I have a primary school age child at home still. Obviously, she is very aware of mental illness and mental health because of what our family has been through. But I also see that it's a topic that's spoken about a lot more in school these days. You know, they talk a lot about their feelings and how to cope with feelings in PHSE lessons. So I actually think that children are kind of clued up these days on mental health. I think the most important thing is for your children to know that it's not about mental health in the abstract that they're aware of, but rather that if they are experiencing issues with their mental health or however that manifests itself, you will always be there for them. And that no matter what they tell you and no matter what they've done or what they are experiencing, or if there are things behind the mental illness that triggers it, that they can talk to you and that you'll support them and always be there for them. And I think having that knowledge that you have a parent who's always there for you is what gets young people through these very difficult years sometimes. And the other thing I wanted to say was that, sorry, it's gone completely out of my head, the other thing I wanted to say, but it will come back to me at some point, sorry.
It will. Give us a shout when you're ready. In the meantime, the space will be filled by Laurie.
Thank you, Judy. No, just a brief as well. And as a father of 4 children, who, and I'm sure they won't be listening, but if they were, anything I were to say in this regard, they would argue that I was wrong. Therefore, I'll need to be very careful in my response. But I would say one of the key things, particularly when talking to slightly older children, is to absolutely acknowledge their feelings, as Debbie was saying, but not profess to have the answers. I think particularly through COVID, that, you know, kids are experiencing something that we never had to experience. We've been blessed, for certainly people my age, blessed with relatively, stress-free living over quite a few decades. We didn't have to suffer a lockdown and a pandemic, and the amount of time that young children, as a proportion of their cognitive life, are actually spending under the pandemic is really quite significant. And I think we need to listen, talk, and just acknowledge that, yes, it's really, really difficult, and we don't have the answers, but it's okay to talk to us about them, and we will acknowledge that things are really, really tough, but talk. So I think there's something about not giving the answers that's as important as anything.
Thanks, Laurie. And back to Judy.
Of course, I remembered immediately as soon as I
Of course
stopped
you
talking.
did.
What I wanted to say was that, from what I understand, young people often start experiencing issues with anxiety around GCSEs and school pressure, sort of high school age. And I think we have to move away as a community from being the kind of parents who quell over their children's amazing GCSE results and A-level results and place huge focus on academic success, to placing equal and more, perhaps greater focus on their health and happiness. And I think that children need to understand that their success in life is not defined by how many GCSEs they come away with, but the kind of people they turn out to be. Around exam time, results time, you see on social media people talking about how their children got 12 A's or 5 A stars or 10 9s or whatever it is these days. We need to move away from that, and that's just a message I think people should keep in mind as their children enter adolescence.
The thing you remembered that one, Judy. Thank you. I'd like to now come to the issue, in fact, that was mentioned in the opening comments, about Blue Monday, as today is called. And the question is, on Blue Monday, I think everyone's feeling a bit low. How do you know when you need to seek professional help in terms of your mental health? And I'm going to go first of all to Sandie.
Thank you. Actually, an interesting point about Blue Monday. I've done lots of stuff on Blue Monday because lots of people in the media always come to me about Blue Monday for quotes and stories and things. It's actually a marketing device. It was created by a marketing company to try and sell holidays. So it's not actually based on any research, but intuitively we feel that it must be right because it does feel a bit low. It's a long time since the winter break and it's a long time till the summer break. So they picked this day, I think the second Monday in January, to try and sell holidays. That's how the whole concept came about. But anyway, it is a time when we're all feeling low. And the really important question is, how do you know when you need professional help for any mental health issues, whether it's today or any day? And I think this is a very good question. And a lot of people ask this, how do I know when to seek professional help? One of the key indicators, I think, for me, is whether it's impacting on your day-to-day functioning. Because I think if it is impacting on you and your day-to-day functioning and that you're not able to do the things that you would normally do, whether that be hobbies or interests or work or self-care or whatever it is, then I think it's really time to seek professional help. So that's my simple response. Obviously, I could go on for hours in a longer response, but that's probably enough for you for the moment.
Thank you, Sandie. Debbie, what's your view on when you should be thinking about seeking help?
Well, I mean, I absolutely agree with what Sandie said. I think it is about impact. But I suppose it made me think when that question came up that there's a degree of that. And it's like, it depends what you mean by professional help. So it may be that there's some kinds of professional help is when the impact is quite severe on your day-to-day functioning. But for instance, one of the organizations I do paid and voluntary work for is called Voiceability. And I train their peer mentors, and I'm one of their peer mentors who work with people who self-refer or who are self-referred from other organizations. And you've just got a volunteer mentor who's there for you over 10 sessions to help you sort out things in your life. So I think it's really interesting now about what we mean when we say professional help. It may be that the bar is much lower for reaching out and getting support. I mean, we talked about Headroom, the cafe. Headroom has also got a program online that I'm involved with. And, you know, there's a peer support groups on that are really well attended by people who don't need professional help in that way, but are having a difficult time through COVID. So I think that's a question for me, while agreeing exactly with what Sandie said.
Thank you. Laurie?
As Sandie said, it's a really interesting question. And I think Sandie and Debbie both made really good points. I think I absolutely concur with what Sandie said, that it's when it impacts on your ability to lead your life. And very simple, possibly overly simplistic analogy. If you leave the front door at the time when we did go out, to go to work, and you always reach the end of the path, I better go and check the front door, and you go back and you check it in its logs, and maybe you do that 2 or 3 times, but then you go to work. Arguably, that's fine. Your door's secure. It's not impacted. But if it gets to the point where you cannot leave the house and therefore you're late for work, or even you lose your job because of that, clearly that's crossed that bridge, so to speak. But I think the point that Debbie made, I think this is part of why we need to have just better dialogue, better conversations about mental health. Because if you think about it, why is it? How have we learnt when we need to go and seek professional help for any health condition? It's happened through the years, through the decades, but talking to other people about their experiences, actually, and people would have no qualms about saying to someone over a coffee, oh, actually, yeah, if that happens, or when it started hurting like that, or when I couldn't do that with my knee, we need to have those kind of conversations so that we're just really comfortable talking about mental health. And then as a community, as a society, we will learn when it's necessary to go and seek professional help.
Thank you. Judy, when do you think it's necessary to seek professional help?
I was going to say exactly the same as everybody else has said. I first took Ruth to the doctor when she was, I think, about 13 years old, so quite a while before her symptoms really started manifesting, because she was having some mild symptoms that might have kind of shown as obsessive compulsive disorder, having to check that things were switched off every night before she went to bed, that kind of thing. And I remember my GP saying exactly that to me. When it gets to the point that's interfering with your everyday life, that's when you need to come back. But I also wanted to talk about how we can take preventative measures. I remember once having a conversation with Laurie, actually, where he told me a frightening statistic that I can't remember about the number of carers of people with mental illness who end up suffering from mental ill health themselves. I think there's a lot out there nowadays, things like the Headspace app where you can learn mindfulness, things like just getting regular exercise, enough sleep, eating a healthy diet, that can really help as preventative measures. And we should all be thinking about doing things like that, not only in the context of a pandemic, but in everyday life, which can be so busy and so relentless sometimes.
Thanks for that advice and guidance from everybody. I wanted to pick up, there was reference, of course, to the workplace. And I wanted to ask our panel whether, and if you feel that it should be mentioned, perhaps to a line manager about mental health issues, if you feel it should be mentioned, and if so, what's the advice about how to mention it? Who'd like to go first? I can see Sandie's there. Go on, Sandie.
It's like an auction, this. If you raise your eyebrow, you get picked on.
I got you.
Yeah, a quizzical eyebrow. Well, I used to specialise in mental health in the workplace. I've moved more over into private areas, but it's a very tricky one. I do a lot of occupational health work, so I do still do that. And it is a very tricky one, because when we were talking before about stigma, there's still the stigma in the wider community, and there's a lot of people who do not want their employer to know, because it goes on their records, or it might go on their records, and the employer might treat you differently. You can be protected, of course, and you can't be discriminated against for mental health reasons. But I would always if possible, encourage people to be open and to say to their employer that they have an issue. It actually gives you protection. It's actually much better for you. It gives you more protection to say, I need some time, or I've been off work because I have this, than just they think you're just skiving for no reason. So I would always say to try and have those conversations, and to have them in if you possibly can, when you're not feeling quite as emotional perhaps as you sometimes might be, but to try and have a calm conversation, and let's try and see it as any other illness. You know, would you feel the same about telling them that you had a back problem, which incidentally, that's the most common excuse that people give for mental health problems. They say they've got a bad back. So if people are off work or needing to be off work for depression, they're far more likely to say they've got a bad back, because that's something that people understand and accept more. But I'd like to see the day when we can just as easily say I was just feeling really low, and that was accepted and understood.
Thanks, Sandie. Debbie, what would you say to people? Should they be raising this about their own mental health in the workplace? And if so, how should they do it?
Well, I'm just going to say that I agree with everything that Sandie said again. I remember back when I was doing lots of training at the Maudsley for their health professionals, and I asked them, we did an exercise about who would they tell, and when it came to their managers, virtually no one put their hand up. And I think that's what Sandie was talking about the reality, and that was like, you know, a top hospital dealing with mental health, and it was really, really ironic. But I agree with her. I think if you don't, I've always, when I've had jobs, talked about my mental health very openly, because if you don't, then you don't get the support, and then if something goes wrong, it's really difficult to manage, and I think it's probably looking for clues though in your employers, like the employers who have employment assistance programs and good policies in place is going to be a safer bet for talking about your mental health than in some others. But I think maybe when you do talk about it, it's a case of how you talk about it is trying to do a bit of education, and being confident enough and having the support outside the workplace to know what you want to say and how you might want to educate your workplace.
Thanks very much, Debbie. Judy, your view on the workplace?
So as Sandie mentioned, employees are protected by law against discrimination for what we're talking about here, which is reasons of mental illness. But obviously we know there's a lot of stigma out there, and the way you feel about talking to your line manager about mental illness is going to depend very much on the culture of where you're working and the level of education about these matters that your line manager or your workplace has. So I think the answer to the question actually starts way back, and it's about those of us who are in positions of management and leadership in workplaces to create the right culture. So Debbie mentioned employee assistance programs, so putting those sorts of things in place. And also, you know, every workplace now has a trained first aider. I believe that every workplace should have a trained mental health first aider as well. And I think having these kind of things in place just subtly change the culture and will mean it's much more likely that if you have a member of staff who's experiencing these things, they will be able to come forward and talk to you about it and disclose it and feel comfortable and safe to do so.
Thanks very much. And Laurie?
Absolutely. I think I think we've reached the point where there's an assumption that somehow employers don't want to know, or that they will do something about it. If you think about it, you know, employees are the tools of most businesses' trade, and why wouldn't you want to look after the tools of your trade, i.e. the people? I'm an engineer by background, and I remember years ago talking to a very long in the tooth engineer that said one of the biggest issues he'd had is that in his workplace people didn't come and tell him that things were going wrong until they broke, and how frustrated he was. And part of the culture and the education that he wanted to do is people to know when it's not quite working right, come and tell me. That's what we need to do for people, and empower people to share. And as I think it was, you know, Sandie was saying, it's about, you know, employers I think genuinely want to have those conversations, and we need to assist them with that. I'm mindful of one of the very early experiences I had when I came to Jami with our employment team, and they'd been approached by someone that was about to lose their job because of very poor mental health. And when they unpicked it, we spoke to the employer as much as we spoke to the employee. And what the employer said was, this person is, he doesn't really get going till about 11 o'clock in the morning. He's kind of just flat, wasn't engaged, won't talk to people. And we spoke to the employee, and they said, yeah, well, my medication is such that I've tried to take it earlier and earlier and earlier in the morning, but even if I take it at 4, I don't get going till 11. So what did we do? We suggested to the employer, well, why don't you work 11 till 7 rather than 9 till 5? It was like, amazing. What an incredible suggestion. That person has now been the most loyal employee and is still in that organisation and is absolutely thriving. What a simple fix. And it's only because they were prepared to have the conversation. Had they had the conversation 2 years earlier, they could have saved all the HR route. The person's health would have been maintained. The employer wouldn't have gone through all the difficulty either. It's all about speaking and being open and being transparent.
Thanks very much. I think we've picked up a lot of not just good insights and reflections, but also advice this evening. So amazingly, we've come to our last question, and it's about students. And it's this. That university students, as we know, have had their studies extremely disrupted. Do you think the policymakers need to do more to prioritise the mental well-being of students? Sandie?
Yes. I'm a university lecturer. I teach applied clinical psychology at a university in the northwest of England. We're passionate about the mental health of our students. I think students are probably the most vulnerable group. And I don't say that lightly because there are so many vulnerable groups out there. But traditionally, you've got a group of young people who are living at home for the first time. And that puts them in a very vulnerable category. This year and last year has been particularly difficult for reasons I don't need to go into. Everybody knows the reasons. And we absolutely have to think very, very carefully about their ongoing mental health. I know that universities are doing lots because my university is, and we're not unique. And I think we only see in the media the negative stuff, but there's so much positive stuff. We have mental health support more than ever before. And in terms of helping people cope with exams and things at the moment, we have no detriment policies that I think almost every university in the UK has. I think there was maybe one that didn't, I won't name them. But most universities have a no detriment policy, which means that nobody should be of any detriment for their exams or for their coursework due to anything to do with COVID. And we will bend over backwards to support students, and that will help their mental health as well. We have mental health support, but is it enough? Probably not. I guess once we go back to the real world, if and when that happens, then we're going to have a whole lot of other issues because the no detriment policy and things won't be in place. And then we need to start thinking about more long-term solutions for what's really a mental health epidemic of problems in the student population. So yes, we need more input, we need more policies, and we need more financial support.
Thank you, Sandie. Debbie, students, how about prioritising their mental well-being?
Yeah, I agree. I think they are a very vulnerable group, and that would include, we hear about students in university, but there's also the students in colleges and FE colleges who are very underfunded. So Sandie talked about financial support, and I think that's where the government could really dip its hand into its pocket and look at as Laurie said, it's just like early prevention. It's catching these young people early rather than letting these kind of develop into problems that should come out later. And there could be a really interesting kind of national program looking at young people's mental health. And what we've got here, yes, we've got a vulnerable group, but what we have also got is, and I think Judy said this earlier, is a group that are very articulate about mental health. So it's not just about providing mental health support, it would be looking at what, and you could do some really interesting things around peer support and other kind of creative forms of mental health support to really acknowledge that this cohort of students, I mean, students can be vulnerable anyway, but this cohort with the epidemic have been going through a really painful situation.
That's very true. Thank you for that, Debbie. And Judy.
So my experience is more in the realms of high school and sixth form college than university, because my daughter has not yet started university. But I suspect that what I'm going to say translates across the board. I think, as Sandie was saying, there have been many programs and policies put in place that look to students and young people's pastoral care to make sure that there are places for them to turn. But I think we need to approach it from a more holistic perspective to make sure that every teacher, lecturer, tutor who comes into contact with students understands what mental illness means, knows what to look out for, and knows how to speak about these things. Our experience with Ruth in high school was from teachers who provided the most incredible level of support and understanding to those who said things like pull yourself together, to the extent that she had one teacher where she was alone in a classroom with him and she said, I want to die. And he said, oh dear, and walked out the classroom. And we can't have that. We just can't have that, because students, no matter how many programs are in place to look after students, if they're going to get caught in that terrible situation before they even get there, then you've already lost the battle. So I think we have to look at it across the board.
Thank you very much, Judy. We have come now to the end of what can only be described as not just fascinating, but a really rich and valuable evening of conversation, but one that I hope that really speaks to people. It's certainly spoken to me, and I want to thank each of our panelists, Debbie, Sandie, Laurie and Judy, for not just sharing their expertise, but sharing their own stories with us, which has really brought impact, and I hope will change the conversation. And with that, I'd like to hand over to James Harris. And James is the president of the Union of Jewish Students, and he's also a deputy on the board of deputies for the Union of Jewish Students. And very, very appropriate that our last question was, of course, James, it was about students, but so I'm going to hand to you for a vote of thanks.
Thank you, Gillian, very much. I really just wanted to extend a hearty vote of thanks to all four of our speakers. Laurie and Sandie, thank you both very much for the incredible work that you both do in both Jami and Jewish Action for Mental Health, respectively. And Judy and Debbie, thank you both for sharing your experience and your knowledge in the mental health arena too. And you know, it's really is well known that that mental health certainly isn't an easy thing to talk about, least of all so publicly in a forum such as this. But it has been incredibly beneficial for me, certainly, and I'm sure for so many people watching live as well, to hear from all four of you, especially, you know, on the extent to which mental health provision for our community has had to adapt so rapidly to support so many people during the pandemic. And I think, you know, from me personally, two of the most important topics that were discussed tonight were when is it right to seek professional mental health help, and of course, as you just noted before, Gillian, the issues surrounding the mental health of students to really reduce the scale of the inevitable mental health epidemic that will sadly exist in the future. Mental health challenges, especially in children and young people, are often direct responses to what is happening in their day-to-day lives, and the pandemic is no exception, unfortunately. Young people who experience mental health difficulties have not had necessarily the support and appropriate intervention, but because of the work that all four of you and so many others across the country are doing to raise awareness of these and so many other important issues surrounding mental health, that number will the sort of number and the scale of that will likely be significantly reduced in our community. And what has been abundantly clear, and just as a closing remark from this panel, is that we have to work harder to bring mental health to the forefront of the agenda, as all our speakers have been doing, to combat the stigma and to break down barriers that this stigma sadly presents. So thank you to our panelists once again. Thank you to Gillian for chairing. And thank you to all of you, all those who have joined live too. And that's it from me.